That churning here is the churning of the breath. It's the churning within the subtle anatomy. This is the churning that is taking place, that is what brings the awakening of the life force. And that churning in turn, of course, is accompanied by the same very occurrence. Just as in the myth, it brings to the surface all the poison as well. And so the job of the one who undergoes through that process is here reminded by the job of Shiva. So in other words, awareness is the only one that is capable of holding that poison. So this is unwavering awareness. This is the reminder of what one is meant to be really taken care of. Because one then takes that poison and keeps it for preventing it, for it to poison the entire system. It simply seems to me fitting that something I'm giving this final sweeping reading from the manuscript of the forthcoming book, right, that I think will serve us as that entrance, perhaps, into what we have already been discussing here. Simply because it feels to me very fitting in terms of the underlying theme of what we have already touched upon. Okay? Then, of course, there is this fundamental underpinning of the actuality of life. Let's just speak to it in direct and honest terms. What is the one thing that everyone craves? What do we all crave in life? What is this one thing that unites us all irrespectively? We may all go about it in different ways, sometimes in diametrically opposing ways, but ultimately, all this, what we call life, is about fulfillment of our potential. And yet, fulfillment seems to be an elusive concept, often a short-lived experience, with everything in life almost designed for us to go astray when it comes to the road to fulfillment. Some teachings are certainly more unapologetic when it comes to the squaring of a round peg in our pursuit for happiness, enjoyment, and whatever else is equated with life being a success story. Sooner or later, it becomes clear that fulfillment is an inherent state of affairs reborn out of the depth of what gives that craving in the first place. From here, the path and the destination are not a clearly marked territory. Some of us mess around with the world. Others are driven by a passion to save it. As perplexing as it sounds, all this somewhat irreconcilable set of circumstances is directly traceable to a lack of peace and contentment, which is again the outcome of that drive towards fulfillment. Whatever else is at play, at some point we learn that the traumas and calamities in the world come from the lack that one is experiencing here and now. Even the idea to change the world comes from that dearth, however seemingly well-intentioned. That externalized projection of changing and even saving maybe remains rooted in the lack one way or another of an innate sense of peace, of happiness. Accordingly, changes in one's consciousness seems to be the last resort, the last vestige of hope. This offering is precisely about that dichotomy, because Kundalini here, as that mythical power, often represented by the serpent of the depth, stands for diametrically opposite qualities. It is at once that which brings the possibility of drinking the juice of one's own immortality, and it is also that which emits the deadly poison into the body. It is that nectar or poison what makes or breaks it, because that's what the power of Kundalini here really represents at the level of human experience and life itself. It is not surprising that in the esoteric language of the respective tradition, Kundalini is spoken of and very often referred to as the serpent coiled to itself 3.5 times, in a state of intoxicated slumber as if swooned, absorbed of its own poison. And in that state of intoxication is completely oblivious to its own nature, to the essence of what it represents, to what it stands for, what it is. The power of Kundalini throughout the history of humankind has always been a highly guarded secret and a formidable quest. Reasons for that may differ from tradition to culture, yet what made all this to converge in the respective goals was the quest for the nectar of immortality, that the internal alchemy of the process is intimately interlinked with, arguably throughout all cultures where this concept survived religious persecution or dismissal on the grounds of theological speculation. The inimitable quest for that which today can be understood in terms of neuroscience as the emphasis given on the role and importance of specific hormones which set to regulate our sense of well-being, where unless the crucial glands which are involved in the secretion of these hormones are rekindled, a psychic disturbance is an inevitable outcome. Being literally starved and deprived from partaking in the most precious substances secreted by the inner lab of the body, it is a small wonder why our culture is so heavily subjected to external drugs of all kinds. It is quite possible that the reason why Kundalini, both as a symbol and as a process, has enjoyed such an ambivalent treatment throughout various traditions in terms of its importance, is due to its utterly unpredictable nature when that power is awakened. Yet despite the obvious dangers associated with tampering with the cosmic force, the incentives towards either one's consciousness being transformed or getting access to the riches of the psychic realm, depending on the respective perspectives emphasized by what was considered of greater value, far outweigh what is us, moderners, would consider as common sense. Hence there has always been that feeling of attraction-aversion, just as one would be confronted with when encountering a snake in the wild. And we are not alluding here to that classical Vedantic snake in a rope analogy, replete with so many non-dual discourses these days. We will examine the very essence of what the process represents and why the process can be so unpredictable, if not volatile, as it is in the nature of consciousness itself. What we live in the world today, literally, what we currently undergo, whatever we may call this fraught state of affairs we find ourselves in collectively, cannot be viewed independently from what is going on at the respective level of consciousness, exemplified in that paradoxical state as being intoxicated by its own poison. And yet, the awakening of Kundalini and what Goddess represents is the power of ultimate healing. To give one example, the topic of trauma has been brought to the forefront of modern-day spiritual conversation, accompanied by the startling realization of how the entire society we live in is considered traumatizing on more levels than meets the eye. Yet if we truly understand what is going on in our psyche at the subtlest level, without the knowledge of Kundalini, and above all else, without proper unfoldment of that process, we cannot truly heal from trauma. The healing will never be complete because Kundalini, as the root cause of our individuality, is the only power of consciousness that can uproot what keeps the content of all individual experiences, so as to metabolize what lies as unprocessed experience, pressed deep into the system, both that of an individual and that of the collective, as our current culture at large. Thus, the nectar or poison. So, I just somehow felt that this extended excerpt from the Kundalini book fits into what we already have touched upon with regard to, let's say, what very difficult to reconcile in terms of how can one homogeneous, one consciousness, how can Shiva consciousness, how awareness, if we are equipped with this particular perspective, where we do not view this aloofness of, let's say, Brahman in relation to Maya, Brahman in relation to the world, which kind of, in a way, easier to explain the calamities in the world, because if we are to take the perspective of the Advaita Vedanta, that perspective which is based on negation of the reality of the world, then we kind of relieved from the potential inner conflict that many theological attempts over the millennia have tried to reconcile. Why, how can there be this magnanimous God, Godhead, which is one and the only, if we are to speak with regard to the monoistic systems, allow the existence of injustice to such level, to such degree, and this whole polemics, for example, in the Abrahamic tradition of the relationship between God and evil, right? That fertile ground of speculations and conversations with perplexing theme of how does evil fits in a system where God is only is. Everything is not only subordinate, everything rests in God. And if we are to apply this Advaitic perspective of the Vedanta, where Brahman stands uninvolved, just as it is in Samkhya system, the only difference is one is dualistic, another one is non-dualistic, then it's kind of explainable. Then, okay, well, yeah, tough titty, this Maya, this appearance here is replete with these contradictions, the opposites that sometimes present themselves in unsurmountable amount of suffering that it can bring at the level of what the existence can present us with. But at least we keep our Lord, we keep the Absolute, right? Unpatched, unmarked. In other words, that the holier than thou remains uninvolved. So we cannot throw any complaint, because it's already, in terms of its respective system, it stands in opposition, right? Just the basic tenets of the Advaita Vedanta. The Brahman is the only real. This world is not real. Okay? And Brahman is the world. Bit more confusing, bit more perplexing. One way or another, the world is not given its reality. Reality is only ascertained in Brahman, in the Absolute. And Brahman is not involved. This is very important. This world is seen as having appearance of its own. And that appearance is in Brahman. But it doesn't have substance of its own. Zero, zilch. It's a perspective which is known as negating perspective. It negates reality to the world. It has its purpose. From that perspective, all the calamities in the world belong to the realm of Maya, belong to the realm of illusion. And of course, it doesn't take long to put two and two together, that suffering is, ultimately speaking, unreal, just as all enjoyment and all relative happiness within the domain of Maya likewise is unreal. Are you following? It's fairly straightforward, isn't it? It's not really a high rocket science here. So it is seen for what it is. World presents the world presents its own dilemmas. But these dilemmas cannot be taken at the face value because they are unreal in their essence. See? So the whole conversation on the what and how and this and that belong to the surface level of discussion, and for the philosopher, for the renunciate, it's of no interest, of no value. What to do in the case of us householders if we adopt this positivistic, all-encompassing perspective, where Shiva is not only involved, this world is a manifestation of Shiva. This whole phenomenal reality is the body of God. These are the declarations. These are the postulates. The world we live in is not just some kind of world driven by its own laws. It is the reality of Shiva, reality of awareness. See? In no time, when we are faced with colossal injustice, tragedy, suffering, these questions do rise. So how does this all possible? And that's where the concept of the manifestation in relation to the Kundalini comes into tremendous import. And it links also simultaneously very ancient Upanishadic myths, the Upanishadic lore, particularly that of the churning of the ocean of existence. Churning, ocean of existence. Where the churning of ocean of existence, as the story goes, was done by both forces of light and forces of darkness, by devas and asuras. Together, it was a conjoined effort. They used a rod as the mount, Mandara, huge mountain, rock. And as a rope, they used the serpent Sesha. So one party holding the head, another party holding the tail, they are churning it. Imagine the rock, Sesha circled around, two ends, and churning it, so rotating that rock submerged into the ocean of existence, with one goal: to extract the nectar of immortality. This myth is of vast importance to not just Indian culture, but of course Indian civilization with that myth influenced the entire Orient. Even I keep repeating that if we go by what Kakuza Okakura, the Japanese scholar, aesthete, and a brilliant novelist who expressed himself perfectly in English, wrote over 100 years ago in his famous The Book of Tea. Everything of value in the Orient comes from India, because that's where the origin, where the source of it all. How it takes form then, how it takes unique, let's say, expression is another story. So this concept of the churning of the ocean resurfaces in the highest tantra of the Shaivites with regard to the concept of Kundalini and the poison and nectar that it emits. So the myth itself, if you're not familiar with it, but it's out there, and As the Devas and Asuras busy in the joint undertaking, all witnessed by Vishnu, who from behind the scenes promised the Devas, who by the way was worshipped equally by forces of lightness and forces of light and forces of darkness. So Vishnu is supposed to take a neutral stand here, but since his job is to preserve and sustain evolution, he promises Devas from behind the scenes that he will make sure that the nectar is theirs. When the nectar appears, he will make sure the Devas will get that. Asuras do not know that yet. The forces of darkness are unaware that that's what will happen. So they see Vishnu as a neutral arbiter of that act. As the nectar begins to rise, it first proceeds by surfacing of poison. Poison, hala hala. So the very antidote to Amritam, the nectar of immortality. This poison now threatens to poison the entire existence that surfaced right to the top. So in one gulp, Shiva takes that and holds it in his throat. Well, of course, there was a petition. There was a quick petition to Shiva, this what's the calamity. And of course, his job is here to do his task. So he takes all that and he holds poison in his throat. Therefore, he is known thereafter as Nilakantha, the blue-throated one. Nilakantha is another name for Shiva. It's because his throat swells and turns the color blue because it's under effect of poison. This, of course, rich with symbolic connotations. Shiva holds that because down from the throat is the elemental order of creation. This is where the creation proceeds from the level of the sound, from the level of the Akasha. Right? From the level of the throat down is material creation. He, as it were, safeguards and saves the creation from that poison being issued straight into the domain of manifestation, and he holds it there. With the unfoldment of the story, which right now I will put a pause, suffice to say that the nectar is extracted and the nectar is being whisked by the Devas when Asuras were distracted by, nonetheless, Vishnu himself. And then, of course, this what is considered by many interpreters of that primordial myth as what sets the deep conflict between the forces of light and forces of darkness, who prior to that worked as allies for the common good. Both went after the nectar of immortality. But that act of treachery, understandably from the point of view of Asuras being betrayed, sets a certain karma in motion, where the Asuras will disrupt the affairs of Devas to this day. The cost of handling the nectar of immortality to Devas is there and then sealed with that karmic repercussion, that Asuras being betrayed have no choice, no chance, but to display their demonic nature. Reflect on this. See? They were tricked. It's a trickstery. And that trickstery now is reverberating throughout creation by an open conflict. So we put a pause here and take ourselves to how that myth is reconfigured, which is featured also in the Kundalini book more than once, precisely because of its direct connotations with the inner alchemy of the process of awakening of Kundalini and what Kundalini represents here at large. That Kundalini here represents this final aspect of manifestation where Shakti is reposed, absorbed in her own slumber, intoxicated by the poison that is released through her sinuous body as a serpent. These connotations are all very, very telling. So everything is subjected to that poison, even if in a state of homeostasis, because this is a state of affairs that Kundalini represent here, which echoes this myth, creational myth, and it's only through the awakening to her real essence that that state can be reversed and immortality can be reclaimed. Because poison obviously here fixes everything in terms of what the poison represents. It represents here death and decay. It represents here all the calamities of what could be described here, separated by a comma, in terms of these qualities that are lacking in our civilizational consensus as that craving where the quote proceeded from. The craving itself comes from the notion, an erroneous understanding or erroneous misperception of our mortality. So the culture itself already cemented in the understanding of everything is based on scarcity. Life itself is seen as transient, has the beginning and end. I'm not going to go into the speculations of how different religions try to ameliorate that. We're sticking here with this particular perspective, which to me feels very fitting because it's not only all-encompassing, it has this alchemical element where what happens at the level of individual processes reflects the cosmic state of affairs in reverse. So this is direct reflection here. So this process that we culturally experience, collectively experience as that which all spheres of our life is now afflicted by that poison, where things literally poisoned. Our minds are being poisoned, our food supply is being poisoned, therefore our bodies are being poisoned, and our soul is being poisoned with incomplete and often bankrupt spiritual and religious concepts. So there's a poison that interpenetrates all spheres. All spheres, just as a footnote, stumbled across the video that I'm going to share with the team, and how in the documentary only made couple months ago, published couple of months ago, that speaks about this chemical that was released into the earth in the United States that was developed by DuPont company, which traces its origin to the experiments during the Second World War that were conducted by Germans, by Americans, and how all that technology was transformed, which also gave birth to the company known as Monsanto. But DuPont in particular, in conjunction with another company, created this very, very toxic chemical. And that toxic chemical is present in a lot of products. A lot of products. And at some point, that toxic element was leaked into the soil right where the cattle and when the milk and beef industry was prior to that thriving potentially into the fourth generation of farmers, only to be shut by the government because they are no longer to produce. In other words, they put the veto, nothing to come out of it. And of course, the title in the YouTube is not just eye-catching, it's not a clickbait, it's the reality of the situation. Corporation, poison, food supply. And why would corporation poison food supply? When this whole thing unfolds, it becomes astonishing because one would first think that it only happens because someone doesn't understand what they're doing. Someone just simply feels, well, it's an experiment that go wrong. But the picture is much more sinister. Much more sinister. It's not that experiment go wrong. It's experiment gone right accordingly. So this is just one minute example of what is happening today. Just as in the 90s, I was startled by this, what the Times would publish at the end of each year, December 31st, the list of richest people in the world, and keep updating it, 100 people. What struck me is how many richest people in the world were all in pharmacological industries. Doesn't matter whether they belong to Switzerland, America, or India. These are the richest families in pharmacology. And the connection between the pharmacology and the connection between the food industry has now been already dissected and looked into, that the food industry is linking its interests with the pharmacological industry so that people are sick from a very early age, because that's the only way to project your income for the next 10 years. How do you know that this drug that you're developing now in the labs and spend a lot of money, that would bring money if you don't have sick people? I mean, come on, if we are to decide here, we're a consortium of people sit down around the table and we talk about the 5-year plan, 10-year plan, and we're launching the drug for what? For just like an attempt to try, maybe someone will buy it? No, we want to make sure that this drug will be bought, right? And what are we going to do with this? We have to create. If there are not enough patients, we'll create them. So, as cynical as this sounds, it's not cynical at all. In fact, I'm speaking in a very, very basic, using very basic terms. If you hear this yourself, if you hear the actuality of the situation, then that picture of the culture based on poison is truly at work. But for us, of course, what's important is to probe into the very, very roots of where this all comes from. And that comes from the place of that craving that asuras and devas carry, craving for immortality. Why would they go into this ordeal, this whole exercise, which is so demanding to get that Mount Madura, to get that session, to get engaged into this, calamus exercise to extract the nectar, because one is swelled with that craving to taste what truly brings satisfaction, to taste what truly gives the sense of quenching all the thirst. See? So, and as long as this is tasted, all other cravings are, as it were, pale. All other cravings are appeased. But if this is not tasted, then these cravings increase. So if we look at it from the global perspective, our culture seems to lost completely the plot a very long time, and all the attention and all the emphasis has been diverted on getting satisfied from what never provides true satisfaction. So therefore, it doesn't matter how many billions this family will have. I'm just giving this example other for a moment, right? So like it's a safe example of other. Someone can have billions in assets and in every way possible. It will still not be enough. You need to keep securing that the income is keep mounting, because that craving is there. You see? Because one knows that the day comes when one will face death. And that craving of immortality deep down in the soul is never met. It is replaced now with a false promise that something is going to saturate one's thirst, which comes with being alive. Just as every deva and every asura have been driven by that very, very craving, is what sets everything in motion and takes the whole civilization on a detour, hopefully, or completely derails it into God knows what area, because it's simply irreconcilable. So what Kundalini here represents then, both in terms of the individual affairs and collective state of affairs, is that it is the power of consciousness that remained dormant to itself, absorbing that poison that is releasing through that intoxication of the oblivion to its essence, so as to partake in the essence of its own immortality, or partaking in the essence, in the juices, which is impossible without the awakening of that power in the first place. This is the alchemical, this is the correlation here. So that churning process that's spoken of in the Puranic or Upanishadic myth, doesn't matter right now, is here seen in the same way. That churning here is the churning of the breath. It's the churning within the subtle anatomy. This is the churning that is taking place, that is what brings the awakening of the life force. And that churning in turn, of course, is accompanied by the same very occurrence. Just as in the myth, it brings to the surface all the poison as well. And so the job of the one who undergoes through that process is here reminded by the job of Shiva. So in other words, awareness is the only one that is capable of holding that poison. So this is unwavering awareness. This is the reminder of what one is meant to be really taken care of. Because one then takes that poison and keeps it for preventing it, for it to poison the entire system. One must mimic Shiva's act. So awakening without mirroring that Shiva's act is prone to potential disaster always, because that poison can literally pollute and affect the entire, as it were, manifested realm of all the structures. And we have seen this in our culture repeatedly in terms of how these processes are gone to DIY, to being suppressed, to being this and that, and how it was supposed to result in the remade consciousness, in a free being, is prone to all sorts of calamities. So this, I felt, is an important aspect to simply weave in of that poison versus nectar, the choice, and how that acts inadvertently, and how that spills what is now at stake, and how awakening processes and what we see perhaps as a, and can be spoken of in terms of demographic explosion, is the true return, the true sense of where consciousness awakens to itself, and it cannot awaken to itself in some abstract realm outside of the human physiology, because that's the correlation, at least that's where the Vedic myth and Tantric cosmogony are agreeing and completely on par with each other, that everything is settled at the level of the human body. The human body as an arena is where all this settles down. Every conflict is settled down at the human level. Every dispute is settled down at the human level. So human is that's where the cosmic forces eventually in our day and age descend or ascend or what have you and settle their affairs. So this is what and why it's so complex, incomprehensible to be human, at least in our day and age. In our day and age, when that division, that again, in terms of certain, let's say, traditional, metaphysical, if you want to call it mythological perspectives, were much clearly marked by every forces residing in their respective realms. That was in the Golden Age, and even in the Silver Age. But as we progress and everything becomes condensed, in the Kali Yuga, in our day and age, everything now is settled, or rather the battlefield moved to the arena of the human being. That's where it is moved. This is where divine beings of all kinds meet in each and every one of us. This perspective exists in Indian civilization. You can check it for yourself. If in terms of the general picture, there are realms, endless realms, from the realm of Patala, the underworld with all its beings, to the realm of, let's say, Gandharvas and heavenly beings, and the realm of all these extraordinary beings, realm of the planets, realm of the devas, realm of the gods. Human being takes some place, somewhere where it balances it all out, somewhere in the middle, where that certain pitch, certain frequencies that is pertinent, we could call human. But the difference in being human is that the karma of a divine being, let's say a Jupiter as a planet, or whatever goddess, is fixed. They cannot transgress, they cannot move. The dharma is fixed for whatever epochs that may take, whatever millions and billions of light years that may be. For the human affair, it's not so. The human life is malleable. It can move. It can move. It can be pulled into any affair. And in our day and age, this is where the forces of light and darkness seem to decide to square their affairs. And that's what makes it so formidable, and that's what serves here as a reminder. So it's not just, this is what it means, none of us exempt from the cosmic drama. It's as simple as that. So if before one can mind one's own business, let's say in Sat Yuga, right? One can mind one's own business because there is different realms, different locus. Gods, demigods, demons, they settle their affairs elsewhere. And we live here happily ever after. That's it. Not too much polluted by any of that, because that cosmic order is maintained by some other forces. Use your imagination. The cosmic order is maintained on our behalf. We are not involved. We don't need to. See? But then it becomes more and more and more emphatic. At some point, it's like there's no choice, but this is it. And that is a reminder. Whether this is an invented some kind of theological, metaphysical perspective to bring the reminder of what the human being here represents, or the reality of the situation. It is for each and every one to reflect on, but to me it seems that either perspective taken here does not absolve us from direct responsibility to our own what? Fulfillment and happiness. It's as simple as that. because it doesn't exist now, in our day and age, outside of ourselves. It no longer exists outside of the domain of who we are. It is here settled. This affair is settled here.